When I first wanted to get into photography, the thing that held me back was the cost of the lenses. It would be hard enough for me to save up for a camera itself, but there was no way I could pay for lenses on top of that. But thankfully, I discovered vintage lenses. These film lenses, adapted onto modern digital cameras, opened up the world of photography to me and are still my main tools to this day. I want to explain why I use these vintage lenses and why they're perfect if you're someone like a college student who wants to get into photography on a budget. Now, how does this work? You can't just stick any old lens on your camera, right? You need to use adapters. What an adapter is basically a hunk of metal that has on the front the mount of the lens itself, and then on the back the mount of the camera that you're actually using. And the reason you need an adapter is because A, the mounts aren't the same, and B, physics needs to work. As you can see here, there's a certain distance between the film and the film camera and the actual lens back. And for the physics and the lens to work, you need to maintain the same distance in our digital sensor and the lens that we're using. And so by using an adapter, we maintain this distance between the lens and the sensor. Speaking of which, this is why using mirrorless cameras is better for vintage lenses than DSLRs. DSLRs have a mirror between the sensor, and so as you can see here, there's less room to adapt a lens onto a DSLR. You'll also have to turn on a feature inside your camera called shooting without lens. And this is because vintage lenses are vintage, they don't have any electronics. And so what this means is that your lens can't talk to your camera. So your camera will think that there's just no lens attached to it, and unless you turn on this feature, the camera won't shoot at all. So now I'm going to talk about some of the pros of shooting vintage lenses. The most obvious one is cost. This lens right here is the Olympus 50mm f1.8. It's the lens that I've been using ever since I started using vintage lenses, and I still use it to this day, and I've taken some of my favorite shots with this lens. And if you go on eBay, it costs around $30 or so. Compare that to Sony's cheapest 50mm f1.8, which goes for around $250. You can see how much cheaper these vintage lenses are. And if you go to a thrift store, it's definitely not uncommon to find lenses for under $10. So price is a really big selling point. Get it? Another pro of vintage lenses is the variety that you can get because they're so cheap. For the cost of one autofocus lens, I can get a wide-angle prime, a 35mm, a nifty 50, a macro lens, a portrait lens, and even a giant zoom telephoto lens. This ability to experiment with different lenses is really helpful when you're starting out taking pictures because you can experiment with different focal lengths, you can discover when the best time is to use a certain type of lens, and also find out what type of lens is suited for your type of shooting style. Oftentimes though, you don't even need to go to eBay or a thrift store to get film lenses. There's a good chance that one of your relatives or someone you know has film cameras that they don't want anymore and they'd be happy to give away to you. For example, my photography teacher gave me his Nikon F2 and several of his Nikkor lenses, and my grandpa had an old Canon AE1 lying around that he gave to me as well. And so this leads me to another pro of shooting vintage lenses, which is that you can get into film photography at the same time. I think for our generation being used to digital so much, it's really useful to be able to experience that tactile, analog process of film photography. It's a different process that puts you in a different state of mind and gives you a whole new perspective on how to take pictures. And you'll be able to use the same lenses on both your film camera and your digital camera. The build quality of these vintage lenses are also really good, a lot better than most modern lenses that you'll find. On vintage lenses, you'll find a lot of metal, a lot of solid aperture and focus rings, and it's overall a much more tactile experience, and the build quality actually makes me enjoy photography a lot more than when I use plastic autofocus lenses. Now, there are definitely cons to shooting with vintage lenses, and I'll explain them, but I'll also explain why I think these flaws are actually a reason to shoot with vintage lenses. After all, that's kind of why I'm still shooting with vintage lenses today. So for most people, the biggest disadvantage to shooting vintage lenses would probably be that you have to focus everything manually. Yeah, it is harder to do, not as quick, and definitely scary at first, but I actually enjoy manually focusing so much that I don't enjoy photography as much when I use autofocus lenses. Having to focus manually makes me slow down, be more intentional about my photographs, and also makes me feel a lot more creative, I think, than when I'm using autofocus. Mirrorless cameras have a lot of great tools that help with focusing, such as focus peaking, or my favorite, punch in to focus. With these tools, I'm able to capture portraits easily and even some sports photos. You definitely have to choose the ones that are in focus out of a lot of pictures that you've taken, but I think this is a sacrifice worth making for the money that you save. Manual focus is also really useful for cinematography. In my papercraft video, I used manual focus because it helped me focus between different things and create interesting types of shots. Another con is that vintage lenses are vintage for a reason. They don't have the latest optics or the coatings on the lenses. So this means that the corners aren't as sharp, you'll get some vignetting when you're shooting wide open at a wide aperture. There's color fringing and chromatic aberration, lens flares. Obviously the amount of this that you get depends on each lens. But to me, this is actually a good thing. A lot of people say that modern lenses are too clinical, too sharp, they're just too perfect. Because with these imperfections, you get a different type of look, character, as they say. But you can actually see it. It's not just like a gimmick or like a way of like writing off this con. It actually does make a difference. When I shoot autofocus modern lenses, I find that when I'm editing, I add vignetting in the corners. I lower the clarity to try to match the look of my film lenses. And if you still want sharpness, you can get plenty of it, even wide open, but especially when you stop down the lens to around f8. This picture right here was taken on my Nikkor 24mm f2.8 at a really low aperture, and this picture won me second place at the Washington State Fair. And as you can see, this is pretty sharp. And so you can still get clinical sharpness if you want out of vintage lenses. So if by now I've convinced you on why vintage lenses are a good idea, then I have a couple of tips on buying vintage lenses. First is, if you inherit a lens, you should just use that. But if you're out shopping for a lens, there are several brands that are good to buy from. So Nikon, or their lenses usually are under Nikkor, Canon FD, which FD is their old mount system, Minolta, Olympus, and Pentax, which I personally don't own any. And I can't talk about vintage lenses without talking about the Helios 44-2. This is really known for its swirly bokeh, and personally it's not for me, but I think it's really cool and useful to at least try it out and see if you like the look. Also, if you're looking to buy a camera to use with your vintage lenses, I really recommend buying a used Sony a7 original or the Mark II. These cameras are full frame, which means that the sensor size is the same size as 35mm film, so you'll be able to use the full optical area of your vintage lenses. And Sony cameras have a lot of really great focusing tools that I talked about earlier that really help with nailing the manual focus. And when you're out buying lenses, try to bring an adapter along so you can actually use the lens on your camera before buying it. If you can't do that, make sure to test out the aperture and focus rings to make sure they're smooth, and also put the lens up to a light source and look for any fungus or other stuff inside the lens. Dust is okay, but fungus really ruins the image quality, so try to avoid that at all costs. Alright, so thanks for watching this video to the end. I hope that I've convinced you that vintage lenses are a good idea if you've been on the fence about starting photography. I'm so grateful that I discovered vintage lenses because I've been able to delve so deep into the world of photography and develop such a deep passion for it. Put any questions or comments that you have down in the comment section and I'll get to them as soon as possible. Drop a like, subscribe if you're not already, and thank you guys for watching this video.